They found blood on the floor of the ER first. Then they saw her face. A deep, ugly bruise bloomed across Nurse Mara Voss's cheekbone, spreading toward her jaw, so brutal under the fluorescent lights that 2 orderlies froze mid-step just to stare. She braced one hand against the trauma bay doorframe, scrubs torn at the shoulder, and nobody, not one soul, asked if she was okay. Nobody pulled her a chair. Chief Surgeon Dale Crown glanced at her the way a man glances at a parking ticket, mildly annoyed, then already over it. "You're bleeding on my floor, Carter," he snapped. "Wrong name. Wrong read on everything. If your pulse just kicked up reading that, buckle in, this story's about to floor it. Hit subscribe, smash that like button, and drop your city and country in the comments. I want proof of how far this thing travels." Now rewind the tape. The shift had kicked off at 6 a.m., and by 9, Mara had already stitched up a screaming 7-year-old, slammed epinephrine into a man whose throat was closing from a bee sting, and talked a terrified teenager out of yanking her own for. Standard chaos. Then, at 9:40, Dale Crown strutted through the doors in his pressed surgical coat like he owned the air itself, announcing to the room that his department was running like a disaster tent and that certain staff needed to get their act together before rounds. Everybody knew who certain staff meant. Mara didn't even flinch. She finished her chart, capped her pen, slid it into the rack with the kind of dead calm that only comes from years of swallowing insults whole. Coastal View Medical Center sat on the edge of Briar Point, Oregon, fog-soaked, half-forgotten, the biggest trauma center for 90 miles. Crown had ruled it for 3 years, arriving from a fancy Scottsdale clinic with a golden reputation and an ego to match. From day one, he'd had it out for Mara. 38 years old, no fancy letters after her name, just RN, which in Crown's world meant furniture with a pulse. But anyone who'd watched her work a code knew better. She moved with a stripped-down precision that rattled even the residents, though none of them could say exactly why. Crown had put it into words once, in a hallway he thought was empty. "She acts like she knows more than the doctors. It's a morale problem." Mara heard every syllable. She kept walking. That's who she was. She didn't waste breath on people who weren't worth the air. Mid-morning, a 4-car pileup on Route 9 sent 3 patients crashing through the ER doors. One was critical, Raymond Polk, 54, unconscious, blood pressure sliding in a pattern. Mara clocked in under 4 minutes. She flagged the resident, Dr. Yusuf Amir. His pressure's dropping faster than his injuries explain. Could be a pneumothorax building quiet. Amir hesitated. An X-ray would take 15 minutes he might not have. That's when Crown rolled up, took one glance, and shut it down cold. "Standard protocol," he ordered, barely reading the chart. Mara pushed once more. Calm but firm, his trachea was shifting. Crown wasn't hearing it. "Are you reading that or guessing?" he said, and walked off to go hunt down why Voss is bleeding on my floor like that mattered more than a man's collapsing lung. She stayed at the bedside anyway, watched the numbers crash, and the second oxygen hit a dangerous low, she was already holding the needle. Amir finally caved. "Do it," and she drove it in clean. Air hissed out. Pressure steadied. Amir exhaled like he'd been holding his breath since sunrise. "Good call," he murmured. Mara just peeled off her gloves. No victory lap. Never was. That bruise on her face? Nothing dramatic. Black ice in the parking garage before dawn. A hard fall into her own car door. She taped it up, popped some ibuprofen, clocked in like normal. But Crown had spotted it the second she walked through the doors and decided, before she'd even hit her 20th minute on shift, exactly what story he wanted it to tell. He'd stopped her cold in the hallway. "That needs documenting by employee health before you touch a single patient. I can't have staff looking like they've been in an incident." She corrected him. "Parking structure. Filed already." but he kept circling back to it all morning like a shark that smelled something worth chasing. By noon, whispers were crawling through the administrative wing, and Mara's name was tangled up in every one of them. She'd survived worse storms than office gossip. This one was just getting started. Then came patient 2, Daniela Owe, 31. Crush injury to her left hand from a construction site, her fingers turning that sickly shade that spells trouble fast. Mara caught it immediately. No radial pulse, hand going cold. She brought it straight to Crown since he was the senior surgeon on the floor. She needs vascular now. 20 minutes and she loses that hand. Crown's answer landed like a slap. That's a medical judgment, Voss. You assess vitals. You don't make surgical calls. He turned his back on her and handed the case to a nervous third year instead. Mara didn't argue. She just stood guard, tracking the clock like a soldier counting down to 0 hour, because someone had to make sure that when the wheels came off, there was somebody ready to catch them. The vascular team rolled in at 18 minutes, 2 minutes ahead of the countdown clock, and Daniela's hand came back from the brink cold but savable. Crown accepted the win like he'd orchestrated it himself. Chest puffed. Not a flicker of gratitude toward the nurse who'd sounded the alarm in the first place. That's when the real gut punch landed. Mara was back at the nursing station, finishing charts, when Crown drifted up beside her. Not across from her, beside her, which should have been her first warning. He set a manila folder on the counter like it was a chess piece he'd been saving all game. I've been in conversation with administration, he said, loud enough for the whole floor to catch the drift. There are concerns about your conduct, overstepping your role. Today isn't the first time. Mara set her pen down slow. Today I called a needle decompression that saved a man from a collapsed lung and flagged a vascular emergency that saved a woman's hand. Those are outcomes, not overreach. Crown didn't blink. That's your characterization. He flipped the folder open, a formal notice, the kind HR only prints once the decision's already locked in. You're on administrative leave, effective now. Security will walk you out. The station went dead quiet, not silent, just that specific hush where everyone's pretending not to listen while listening hard. Mara had 100 things she could have fired back. She said none of them. I'll need a copy of that, she said instead, calm as still water, and Crown slid it over like he was doing her a favor. She gathered her badge, her jacket, her dignity, and let a young security guard named Garrett walk her out. A kid who once asked her how to wrap a sprained wrist and looked mortified to be escorting her now. At the exit, she turned back one last time. Nobody in that ER met her eyes. Then she pushed into the Oregon fog, and the doors sealed shut behind her like a verdict. The military convoy rolled in at 12:47. Mara was still parked outside, engine off. Not because she couldn't drive. She'd survived worse than a pink slip, but because 4 minutes after walking out, her phone had rung. A voice she hadn't heard in 4 years. A ghost from a life she'd buried on purpose. The message was 6 words. Briar Point, Coastal View. He needs you. She tried calling back. Dead number. Gone like smoke. Then she saw the convoy through her windshield. 3 federal vehicles moving with the kind of precision only military drivers carry. Sliding into the ambulance bay like they owned the pavement. Mara knew that formation. She'd ridden in convoys just like it, in places where the stakes were higher and the roads were worse. That life was supposed to be over. She told herself she was just curious. Maybe she was. Either way, her feet carried her out of the car before her brain finished arguing about it. Inside, the ER buzzed with the specific electric tension of a real trauma, not routine chaos, but something heavier. Garrett spotted her and opened his mouth to object. I know, she said, and kept walking, because what was he going to do? Tackle her? Through the trauma bay glass, she saw a patient laid out, injuries that screamed blast trauma, not car wreck damage. Crown was barking orders at the head of the table. And just inside the entrance, arms crossed, radiating command without a single stripe visible from that distance, stood a man she recognized down to her bones. Brigadier General Thomas Ward. 53 now, grayer at the temples, deeper lines carved into his face, but unmistakably him. 4 years ago, in a rain-soaked staging area with 14 wounded soldiers and 2 working vehicles, she'd fought beside this man through odds military planners later called non-viable. Now here he was, standing in a small-town civilian R like he'd just stepped out of a memory she'd worked hard to bury. Mara froze. His eyes swept the room with that same military scan, systematic, clipped, classifying everything in a heartbeat. They slid past her, came back, locked. He went absolutely still. 4 years of careful anonymity evaporated in 3 seconds flat. He murmured something to the aide beside him, then crossed the floor with the controlled urgency of a man trying not to spark a scene. He stopped 2 feet away, studied the bruise on her face for a beat too long, then met her eyes and said just one word, quiet and dead certain. Voss. Not a question. General, she answered. That's you. All this time, he said, this is where you landed. I'm a nurse. I know what you are. His gaze flicked toward the trauma bay. That's Colonel James Rutherford. Special Ops. His bird went down 60 miles out. Tell me what you're seeing. I'm on administrative leave, she said flatly. Escorted out 40 minutes ago. Something shifted behind Ward's eyes. Not shock. More like a man filing a fact away for immediate, ruthless use. Are you hurt? His eyes flicked back to the bruise. Parking structure. Yesterday. Okay, he said quietly. Then, Mara, what do you see? She looked. 7 seconds, longer than her instincts usually needed, shorter than most people would believe was enough. Crown's team was chasing the obvious wounds. But Mara clocked something else. The patient's color was wrong. His abdomen faintly rigid on the left. He's got a secondary injury nobody's caught, she said. Left upper quadrant. Splenic, maybe hepatic. If they close him up without finding it, he crashes in the ICU in 6 to 8 hours and nobody upstairs will understand why. Ward's jaw tightened. They told me Valkyrie was Kia, he said. After the evacuation. Valkyrie, her old call sign, buried with the rest of her old life. I know what it was, she said. Grief flickered across his face, tangled up with something closer to relief. 4 years, Mara. I know. Inside the bay, the monitor's rhythm sharpened into a scream. Crown's voice rose, directing, pushing, and through the glass Mara watched his team's controls start to slip. I need to go in there, she said. You're on leave, Ward reminded her. I'm on administrative leave. There's a difference between what that notice says and what that patient needs. She was already moving. I'll handle the leave, Ward said, 1 step behind her. She shoved through the bay doors. Crown looked up, his face flipping from focus to fury in half a second flat. Voss, you were escorted out of this building. His left upper quadrant is rigid, she shot back, snapping on gloves. How long's it been presenting? You have no clearance to be in here. Security. Look at his abdomen, Dr. Crown. The room went dead silent. The specific silence that drops when 2 competing authorities collide and everyone has to pick a side in real time. One of the nurses, Petra Sloan, 6 years on this floor, and years of quietly swallowing her own opinions about Dale Crown, stepped forward and looked at the patient's abdomen herself. She's right, Petra said, voice low but steady. It's been tensing. I flagged it 10 minutes ago. Crown rounded on her. Nobody asked for your assessment, Sloan. I'm asking, came a voice from the doorway, General Ward, filling the entrance with the kind of presence that made even Crown recalibrate. 2 military medics flanked him. Crown opened his mouth to argue, then thought better of it, 3 full seconds of dead silence ticking by before he managed. This is a civilian facility. This patient is under my care. This patient is under military medical jurisdiction, Ward answered. ICECOM. And you're going to let that nurse work? Crown looked at Mara. She was already palpating the abdomen, working outward from center, watching the monitor dip. Fast ultrasound, now, she told Torres, the wide-eyed third-year hovering nearby. Left upper quadrant, I need to know if there's free fluid. Torres bolted to obey. Crown stood frozen, watching a nurse he'd just fired take command of his own trauma bay with an authority he'd only ever read about in after-action reports. Never lived it, never bled for it, and privately never believed the stories were as bad as they sounded. The ultrasound confirmed it in 30 seconds flat. Free fluid pooling. Splenic laceration, Mara said. Grade 3, maybe 4. He needs the ore. She looked up and caught Ward's eyes. Recognition mixed with something older. Something that had been waiting years to surface. Get him up, she told the room, and the room moved. They had Colonel Rutherford in the ore in 4 minutes, blistering fast, and faster than Crown thought humanly possible given how many protocols got steamrolled to make it happen. He watched the gurney roll away from his post near the nurse's station, wearing the expression of a man who'd just had something stolen and hadn't decided yet whether to call it theft or surrender. Mara ran alongside, one hand near the patient's wrist, reading his pulse the way only someone who'd learned in the field could. Machines only tell you so much. Torres flanked the other side. 2 of Ward's medics brought up the rear. Ward himself stayed behind in the ER. Mara noticed. She filed it away. The ore suite was solid, if a couple years behind the big city trauma centers, but solid was enough when the hands running it knew their business. Dr. Ingrid Paul, the anesthesiologist, sharp and no-nonsense after 9 years at Coastal View, clocked the bruise on Mara's face and the ghost of that leave notice hanging in the air around her. You're scrubbing in? Paul asked. Yes. On whose authority? General Ward's. Paul weighed that for exactly as long as it took to check the vitals, 3 seconds, then said all right and got to work. Dr. Renfrew Okafor, the attending, arrived gowned and already reading the scan Torres had pushed to his tablet. Methodical, steady, never flashy, but never sloppy either. He clocked the situation fast. Fired nurse, scrubbing in, general's orders. The general authorized it. Torres cut in before anyone could ask. Okafor studied Mara, studied the patient's crashing numbers, and made his call. Then let's not waste time talking about it. Mara moved to the scrub sink. 2 hours and 11 minutes. That's what it took. The splenic laceration turned out to be grade 4, worse than the scan suggested, which tracks with high-velocity trauma. And buried underneath it, a secondary injury nobody had caught. A partial tear in the diaphragm, explaining the subtle breathing hitch Mara had clocked from outside the glass before she'd even had words for it. There, she said the second Okafor opened him up. He looked, went quiet a beat, then nodded once and shifted his whole approach around it. It wasn't a clean ride. 53 minutes in, Rutherford's blood pressure bottomed out, and Paul's voice sharpened as she called numbers, pushed fluids, fought to hold the line. 90 seconds of pure held-breath silence, nothing but monitors and focused hands moving fast, before the pressure started climbing again. Slow, jagged, reluctant, but climbing. Mara never stepped outside her lane. She wasn't the surgeon, never claimed to be. What she did, what she'd always done, was watch the whole patient while the surgeons locked in on the surgical field. She caught the pressure trend before the monitor screamed about it. She noticed the faint mottling creeping into Rutherford's hand that meant something was still bleeding somewhere unaccounted for, and called it, and Okafor found a small arterial bleeder tucked behind the bigger wounds and shut it down. The mottling cleared. Torres watched every second of it from his post by the instrument table, quiet, absorbing lessons his residency program hadn't figured out how to teach yet. At 2 hours and 8 minutes, Okafor started closing. At 2:11, he stepped back and said one word, "Good." From a man like Okafor, that was practically a standing ovation. Rutherford went to the surgical ICU, vitals rough but holding, which after the last 3 hours counted as a small miracle. Mara stripped her gloves at the scrub sink and let the water run over hands that never shook. They never had. Not even in that valley 4 years back, with the ground shaking and a second convoy burning 200 meters out and 14 men needing decisions made faster than decisions should ever have to be made. Steady hands had kept people alive. She'd stopped questioning whether that was a gift or a wound a long time ago. She dried off and went looking for Ward. She found him in the small family consultation room off the main hallway, the kind of room built for conversations nobody wants, which meant it was always empty and always smelled faintly of old coffee and industrial carpet. He stood at the window, staring into fog so thick it swallowed the far row of cars whole. A paper cup sat untouched in his hand. "Rutherford's in the ICU," she said. "Pressure's holding." Okafor closed clean. Ward nodded, still watching the fog. "The diaphragm tears repaired," she added. "He handled it well once we found it." "You found it," Ward said, turning to face her at last. That focused attention she remembered so well settling on her again. Pointed at it. "He fixed it." Ward studied her, the bruise, then her eyes. "Tell me about that bruise." "Parking structure." "Not the bruise. Tell me why you're a floor nurse in Briar Point, Oregon." "Because I applied for the job 4 years ago and they hired me." "Mara." She sank into a chair, feet aching. The adrenaline of the last 3 hours finally draining into bone-deep exhaustion. "I was done," she said. "After Kandesh, I was done with that life." "You were listed, Kia." "I know. Do you know how many people," he stopped himself, started over. "I spent 8 months on a review board trying to piece together what happened during that evacuation. The record says you went down in the second vehicle. The one that burned. The record's exactly what I needed it to be." He went quiet. "You arranged that." "I had help. From someone who understood I needed to stop." She held his eyes. "It wasn't desertion, Thomas. I gave 9 years. I did things over there I'd do again, and things I can't explain to anyone who wasn't there. When it was over, I needed to disappear. Not process out with a ceremony and a paper trail anyone could follow. I needed to be gone." Ward set his cup down slow. "The person who called you this morning," he said. "Who was it?" "You don't know? Should I?" She studied him 2 seconds longer than comfortable. He didn't flinch. "Someone told me you were here, that Rutherford needed me. It wasn't me who made that call. I know that now." She thought it through out loud. "Someone knew you were coming here. Someone who knew about me and knew how to reach you. The number they used was old, from before Kandesh." The dread she'd been carrying since the parking lot shifted from background static to a full-blown problem. Only a handful of people ever had that number. People who are either still active or people we should be hunting. Ward sat down across from her, the room shrinking under the weight of what neither of them was quite saying yet. "Someone put you here on purpose," he said. "Someone knew Rutherford was headed to Coastal View. Knew I'd be with him. Knew you were here. Knew exactly how to reach you. That's not coincidence. No." She looked at her hands. "And Rutherford had a secondary injury that kills him in 6 to 8 hours if I'm not in that bay. If Crown hadn't thrown me out this morning, I'd have been inside working, and he never would have let me near Rutherford's case." The logic clicked into place with cold, ugly clarity. "Whoever made that call knew exactly how this hospital runs. They put me exactly where I needed to be." Ward's face darkened. "The question," he said slowly, "is whether that person's trying to help Rutherford, or make sure he doesn't make it." The room went dead quiet. "He's in the ICU," she said. "He's not safe yet." Ward was already reaching for his phone. He fired off 3 calls, clipped and precise, the language of a man fluent in emergencies. Mara caught the shape of it without chasing the details, clearance codes, authorization terms she'd spent 4 years trying to forget the grammar of. When he hung up, he looked at her. "I've got people heading to the ICU now. Nobody gets near Rutherford without credentials I personally sign off on. Crown's going to fight that. Let him. Flat. No heat needed. I need everything you remember about Kandesh. Every detail, every second before you went dark." He glanced at her bruise again. "And I want someone to actually look at that. It's not broken. You don't know that." "Thomas," she said, the same way she'd said his name 4 years ago, the tone reserved for someone you trust to do the job if you do yours, and who doesn't need to be babied on top of it. "One thing at a time," he said, something close to a smile ghosting across his face, the same worn-down, almost smile she remembered, the one that said the job never left room for the full version. "All right," he agreed. The door swung open without a knock. Garrett, the security guard, looked like a man holding a live grenade instead of a radio. "Miss Voss, Dr. Crown's outside. He's saying you're trespassing. Wants admin called." Mara looked at Ward. Ward looked at Garrett. "Tell Dr. Crown," Ward said, same measured tone he'd used on the phone, "that this room and the ICU suite on the 3rd floor are currently under a federal patient security protocol, and that interfering with authorized personnel is now a federal matter." Word for word. Garrett blinked. "Should I write that down?" "Yes." Garrett pulled out a notepad he'd apparently carried for 3 years without ever needing it. Until now. The next hour turned into administrative trench warfare, all conducted just below the threshold of a full-blown shouting match. Crown climbed the chain of command with the efficiency of a man who'd clearly prepped for exactly this fight. Nursing supervisor, on-call administrator, risk management, all pulled into the hallway within 40 minutes. Mara heard the noise of it from inside the ICU, standing near Rutherford's bed beside one of Ward's medics. Eyes locked on the monitors like they mattered more than anything happening in that hallway. They did. Rutherford looked smaller than he probably was in real life, buried under tubes and sedation. That's what the ICU does to everybody. His color was better than it had been in the OR. His pressure was holding at numbers she wouldn't have bet on 4 hours earlier. A dressing covered his left side. A chest tube ran from the right, and the monitors ticked along in the steady rhythm of systems doing exactly what they were built to do. She pulled up a stool and settled in beside him the way she'd settled beside hundreds of beds before. Fully equipped ICUs, dust-choked field stations running on generators, didn't matter. The skill didn't change. Watch the whole patient, not just the numbers. Catch what happens before the monitor screams about it. Torres appeared in the doorway, clocked the military medic, clocked Mara, walked in anyway, something worth remembering about that kid. "How is he?" he asked quietly. "Holding. Diaphragm repairs stable." "Okay." He glanced around. "How's the floor?" Torres made the face of someone trying to summarize chaos that refuses to summarize. "Dr. Crown's saying things. About me. About your qualifications. About whether what you did in the OR counts as practicing medicine without a license. Everything I did was under Okafor's direction, with full physician oversight. Nothing happened without his authorization. I know. I was there." He hesitated. "For what it's worth, Pulk, the first patient this morning, he's stable. Family's with him. He's going to make it." Mara didn't say anything to that, but she hadn't forgotten Raymond Pulk, or Daniela always hand wrapped somewhere in recovery. She didn't need to speak their names out loud to keep the ledger. "Thank you," she said. Not quite confirmation she'd heard him, but close enough. Torres left. She sat with Rutherford, the monitors, the fog pressing against the glass, and the sound of raised voices down the hall. Dale Crown hitting a register he usually saved for people he was sure he could bully. She was starting to think he'd miscalculated badly. Ward walked into the ICU just after 4 p.m., nearly an hour deep into the administrative war. his jaw tight but everything else locked down tight. He carried a tablet and the look of a man who'd found something he wasn't hunting for, and hadn't decided yet what to do with it. He stopped at the foot of Rutherford's bed, checked the monitors, checked Mara. His attending just changed, he said. She looked up. Crown? Requested off the case voluntarily, according to the administrator. My guess, that conversation about federal protocol was pretty educational for him. He glanced at the tablet. But that's not the interesting part. What is? My office pulled Rutherford's medevac transport records. The route, the timing, why they picked Coastal View over the Portland Trauma Center, which is closer and better equipped. The cold feeling crept back into her chest, the logic clicking into a shape she didn't like one bit. Someone routed him here on purpose. Someone in transport coordination filed a falsified weather report that grounded the Portland flight path. Forced the reroute. He looked up. It was filed 6 hours before his helicopter went down. The number sat between them like a live wire. 6 hours before the crash, she said. Ward held her eyes. Someone knew he'd need a medevac before he needed one. The monitor beside Rutherford cycled steady. Outside, the Oregon fog had thickened into that dense gray-white wall that swallows everything past the parking structure. The exact spot where she'd sat 4 hours ago, watching a convoy roll in and feeling her old life reach out and grab her by the collar. Someone crashed his helicopter, she said. We don't know that yet, but someone knew it was going down. Ward said nothing, which was its own kind of confession. She looked at Rutherford's chest rising and falling, thought through the chain of it, Crown's leave notice that put her outside the building, the call that pulled her back in, the convoy arriving at a hospital that made zero clinical sense as a first choice, a diaphragm tear that would have killed him quietly in the ICU if nobody caught it, and a hospital staff where exactly one person was wired to catch it. Someone's using me, she said flatly, no anger, just naming the thing correctly. Or protecting him through you, Ward said. Depending who it is. Those aren't mutually exclusive. No. He closed the tablet. I need everything you remember about Kandesh. The voice on that call, too, anything at all. Under 30 seconds. Synthesized, I think. Voice modulation, not a live person. High quality. Yes. Not something thrown together fast. She thought back to the texture of that recording, careful, neutral, precise. Whoever built this planned it weeks out, at least. Which means they've known where I am for a long time. Yes. The weight of that settled over the room. 4 years of careful invisibility, new city, real nursing credentials under her actual name, no social media, no old contacts, the slow, patient work of burying a past life until it started to feel like it happened to someone else. Someone had seen straight through all of it. The ICU door opened. Gerald Fitch, the hospital administrator, thin, precise, the haircut of a man who called a lot of lawyers, walked in carrying news he clearly didn't want to deliver. Ms. Voss. General Ward. He nodded at Ward with visible effort to calibrate respect against anxiety. I've spoken with legal counsel. The administrative leave notice issued this morning is under review. Under review, Ward repeated. Circumstances have evolved. Fitch looked at Mara like the next sentence cost him something. I've also learned that Dr. Crown's personnel file contains 14 complaints from nursing staff and residents over the past 26 months. Complaints escalated to administration and never formally reviewed. The monitor beeped steady through its cycle. 14, Mara said. Over 26 months. Fitch stared at the window. Primarily nursing staff. 2 residents. They describe a pattern, dismissal of clinical concerns, professional undermining, and in 3 cases, conduct that created what the complainants called a hostile environment for patient safety. Mara thought of Petra Sloan at the scrub table, saying she's right in the same quiet voice she'd probably used a dozen times before, never once getting heard. What happens to those complaints now? The board's been notified, Fitch said carefully. There'll be a formal review. External oversight. Ward's gaze stayed locked on Fitch a beat too long. A silent promise that formal had better mean exactly what it said. "Thank you, Mr. Fitch." Fitch left. The room settled into the steady beep of monitors and the fog pressing the glass like it wanted in. 14, Ward said quietly. "I know you weren't the first. I know that too." She looked at Rutherford's slack, sedated face, bigger than it probably looked awake, commanding operations from a helicopter over brutal terrain. "I need to know what he was working on before he went down. That's classified. Someone crashed his helicopter and rerouted him to my hospital, Thomas." She met his eyes. "At minimum, tell me if it's the kind of classified that comes with a list of people who want him dead." Ward went quiet, the kind of quiet with real thought behind it. "Yes," he said finally. "It's that kind." "Then whoever called me this morning knew about his operation." "Yes." "Which makes the list of people who could have made that call very short." He looked at her. "And it includes people who are supposed to be anywhere except Briar Point, Oregon." She sat with that. "How short?" she asked. Ward opened his mouth to answer, and his phone buzzed. He read the screen, and whatever was on it flipped his stillness from careful to something sharper, more alert, the shift a person makes when a managed situation suddenly demands they run. He turned the screen toward her. "For words and a room number. He's already inside. ICU." Mara was moving before Ward finished reading. She hit the ICU door at a pace just shy of a full sprint. Running triggers panic, panic triggers mistakes, but as close to running as the space allowed. The military aide stationed outside the door was gone. First wrong thing. The call light above Bay 3, Rutherford's Bay, blinked amber, steady and patient, meaning someone had triggered it and nobody had answered. Second wrong thing. And standing at the foot of Rutherford's bed, back to the door, was a man in scrubs and a hospital ID badge, meaningless credentials, the kind hospitals hand out to anyone who fills out a form. Compact build, deliberately unremarkable face, the stillness of someone who'd already made his decision and was mid-execution. His right hand hovered near the 4-line. "Step away from the bed," Mara said. He turned. Somewhere in his 40s, a face built to leave no impression, which was, in itself, an impression. His eyes flicked from her to the door and back, running the math on whether the plan still held. Didn't. Ward cleared the doorway 2 seconds behind her, took in the scene in one sweep, and barked something short and sharp into his phone. The man's expression shifted, not fear, but recalibration, the look of someone realizing the variables had just changed on him. "Hands," Ward ordered. The man's right hand drifted from the 4-line. His left came up, palm open. Mara was already at the line, checking. Port intact, seal unbroken, but clipped to the tubing 2 inches above the port sat a small device, no bigger than a thumbnail. She recognized it instantly, not from nursing school, from training civilians never receive. "Don't touch it." She snapped at the ICU nurse who'd appeared in the doorway, drawn by the call light. "Get me a clamp. Now." He scrambled, came back with one, and Mara clamped the line above the device, isolating it before anything inside could reach the port. She checked the seal twice, once wasn't enough. "Line's clean," she told the nurse, "but I want it pulled and replaced. Fresh bag, fresh line right now." The man hadn't moved, still watching Mara with the particular focus of someone doing rapid triage on how badly he'd just miscalculated. 2 of Ward's people burst through the door at a dead sprint, plain clothes, but moving in a way that made the lack of uniform irrelevant. The man clocked them the same way he'd clocked Mara, and whatever conclusion he reached made him raise his hands higher and step back, careful, calculating, a man who understood tactical math, and the math had just changed on him for good. "Sit down," Ward said. On the floor. The man sat. The next 40 minutes turned into the kind of controlled chaos that looks like madness from outside and feels like slow motion from within, because every single decision carried weight. The Portland FBI field office got the call. The state police liaison got the call. The hospital slid into a quiet lockdown. No PA announcement, just covered exits and nobody moving in or out without clearance. Mara stayed at Rutherford's bedside through all of it. Brandon, the ICU nurse, 14 months on the job, about to remember this shift for the rest of his career, swapped out the 4-line with the steady hands of someone who found comfort in doing the familiar task while the unfamiliar one unraveled around him. He did it clean and correct, and she told him so, and he exhaled like he'd been holding that breath since the amber light first blinked. The device got photographed in situ, then bagged by one of Ward's people in gloves. Mara didn't need the lab results to know what she was looking at, a clip-on controlled release mechanism, positioned at exactly the point in the 4-line where a slow-acting compound could be introduced without tripping an immediate monitor alarm, only to accumulate over hours into something that would look, in a fragile post-op patient, like a natural complication instead of murder. She'd been trained to spot exactly that kind of device, just never in a place like this. Ward returned once the intruder had been hauled out and the acute crisis had settled into uneasy quiet. "Do you recognize him?" he asked. "No, but the device is built for targeted pharmaceutical interference. High-end, not improvised. His ID's false, but good. Manufactured, not bought." He looked at her. This was resourced. Someone sent a professional. And that professional was in Rutherford's Bay before your people at the entrance ever clocked him coming in, she said. Which means either he beat the lockdown or your people missed an entry point. Ward didn't dodge it. Either way, that's a failure on my end. You stopped it. You stopped it. I was reading a text. She didn't argue the point. Instead, what does your team actually know about what Rutherford was working on? Enough to explain why someone wants him dead. Ward moved to the window back to the room unusual for him. His unit's been running counterintelligence out of a staging area up here for 7 months. Targeting a network moving compromised intelligence personnel, burned assets, turned assets, people who were never really ours through domestic infrastructure. Mara processed that. He's dismantling a network using civilian institutions as cover. Hospitals. Ward turned. Why hospitals specifically? Because that device is sophisticated enough that whoever built it understood ICU protocols down to the exact window where pharmaceutical interference reads as natural complication instead of foul play. You don't know that unless you've got people embedded, not as patients, as staff. The room went quiet. From the corridor, the ordinary hospital noise carried on, carts rolling, voices at the station, but it had a different texture now. The specific hush of a place where something dangerous had just passed through and might not be finished. "How many people at this hospital have been vetted?" she asked. "My people have. Hospital staff, no." "Then you need to find out who talked to that man before he reached this floor. Who got him a badge. Who looked the other way at the entrance." She held his gaze. Someone in this building knew he was coming. The investigation that followed was quiet, thorough, and deeply uncomfortable for everyone involved. Ward's team, working alongside an FBI liaison named Reyes who'd arrived from Portland with suspicious speed, tore through security footage and badge logs with the focus of people who already had a shape in mind and were just filling it in. Mara wasn't cleared to participate directly, and she understood why, but her nurse's brain kept cataloging details anyway. The charge nurse who'd been strangely hard to locate during the critical window. The military aide outside the ICU who'd been pulled away by a family emergency in the stairwell that turned out to be neither family nor emergency. She reported it all to Ward and went back to Rutherford's bedside, because that was the job. He was starting to surface from the deepest sedation, not awake, not close, but changing texture, the slow, effortful climb of a person dragging themselves back toward consciousness. Torres appeared in the doorway again, running on fumes. "Crown's missing," he said. "I don't know where he is." Mara stood fast. "Have you told Ward?" I'm telling you now. They found Ward in the hallway with Special Agent Reyes. Crown's missing, Mara said. As of when? Reyes asked. About an hour. Badge logs confirmed it minutes later. Crown's credentials used at the North Service exit at 2:53 p.m. 47 minutes prior. Then parking structure footage picked up his vehicle, registered to a Delaware shell company. Reyes was already running the plate. He's running, Mara said. Or, Ward said quietly, he knew we were looking before we started looking. Confirmation came fast and ugly. Security footage from the north stairwell showed Crown descending with the stiff, over-deliberate gait of a man being walked, not walking, a stranger in maintenance coveralls beside him, one hand low against Crown's back. Reyes watched it, absorbing a serious update to her operational picture. He knew something, she said, and they didn't want him talking. Mara studied the frozen frame of Crown's face. Not guilt, not defiance, but raw, uncontrolled fear. The look of a man who'd learned too late exactly how far over his head he'd been swimming. He wasn't running the network, she said. He was being used by it. Reyes's radio crackled. Crown's vehicle had been found abandoned 4 miles north. 2 unconscious bodies inside. Crown and the stranger from the footage. Both sedated, both alive. Taped to the dashboard, a handwritten note. For words that turned the whole case sideways. Send Valkyrie or else. Mara stared at the photo Reyes handed over. No confusion left, no room for guessing. They're not trying to kill Rutherford anymore, she said. They're trying to trade him for me, for what I know. She looked at Ward. For years ago, in Kandesh, I treated someone who shouldn't have existed according to the official record. I filed a report. It went nowhere, and then I turned up dead. Someone's been sitting on that report for 4 years, praying it never became evidence. Rutherford's case was about to drag it into daylight, which means the name in your report, Ward said slowly, is still active. Yes. Reyes ran it down fast. A shell consulting firm, Nexbridge, holding efficiency contracts with 7 Pacific Northwest hospitals, including Coastal View, dating back 14 months, 1 month before Rutherford's operation ever opened. Crown hadn't been running the conspiracy. He'd been shaped by it, one small favor at a time, until the favors became a body count. A nurse named Petra Sloan came forward with the missing piece. A consultant named Robert Ainsley who'd walked the halls 2 weeks earlier, clearly casing the building, not consulting it. Then Fitch, the administrator, went missing too, found on the maintenance roof, phone in hand, mid-call to the very people threatening the hospital. Terrified, cornered, and finally honest. He'd been feeding the network hospital data for months, believing it was just paperwork, just politics, until 14 buried complaints and 1 dashboard note made the truth impossible to outrun. The trail led to one name Ward had been sitting on for 6 months. Harlan Voss, former deputy director of a federal intelligence office, officially retired 14 months back, unofficially still pulling every string. He was close. Cell tower pings placed him within 3 miles of the hospital. He'd come himself because the asset had failed, Crown was compromised, and only one person could still make his problem disappear. Mara. She agreed to draw him out, wired, covered from every exit, walking alone into the East Service corridor while a hidden team held position. Voss was waiting, older than she'd built him up to be in her head, steady-faced, dangerous in the quiet way of a man who'd spent a career learning to look unremarkable. Valkyrie, he said. That's not my name, she answered. He wanted to know what was in her statement, whether there was still something left to negotiate. There isn't, she told him, flat and unshaken. It's done. The case file has what it needs. You burned an asset and exposed your own network for nothing. He tried to justify it. The operation had value, the intelligence mattered, context she couldn't understand. You crashed a helicopter, she said. You planted a device on a dying man's foreline. You had a hospital administrator hauled out of his own building. There's no context that covers that. Something in his face finally cracked, not defiance, just exhaustion. A man doing arithmetic he no longer liked the answer to. That's when Reyes's team moved in. Voss's hands went up before anyone even gave the order. The gesture of a man who knew the math was over. He looked at Mara one last time. You should have stayed dead, he said. I know, she answered. I almost did. The door closed behind him, and just like that, it was finished. The next 72 hours moved fast. Voss was arraigned on federal charges before midnight. Nexbridge collapsed under a court order. Ainsley arrested at his home in Portland. Crown's license was suspended. His 14 buried complaints reopened by an outside board that didn't blink at what they found. Fitch resigned, his letter carrying the closest thing to an apology he had in him. Rutherford was transferred to a secure military hospital days later, awake, alert and blunt as ever. You saved my life twice, once in the oar, once by not staying in your car when you had every reason to. That's the whole thing, Voss. That's all any of it is. Mara's administrative leave notice was formally torn up, the board's letter carefully worded to avoid ever quite saying we were wrong. But she didn't need the apology. She needed the pattern broken, and it was. Ward offered her something new. A federal consulting position auditing the exact kind of hospital vulnerabilities that had almost gotten a colonel killed, with real authority, real teeth, no committee able to bury her findings the way Crown's complaints had been buried for years. She took it, not for the title, never for the title, just because the work mattered and someone finally handed her the power to make sure it stuck. 3 weeks later, at a short staff acknowledgement nobody dressed up as a ceremony, Ward stood in uniform and called her one word that landed harder than hero ever could. Consistent. Consistent in her judgment. Consistent in saying exactly what she saw, even when silence would have been so much easier. That was the room's real gift to her. Not applause, just recognition finally catching up to years of it being overdue. Mara didn't linger on it. She went back to the ER, back to Bay 4, where a teenage boy with a bikefall gash above his eye was fighting hard not to cry. She pulled a stool up to his eye level because the first thing you do with a scared kid is get out of the position of authority and into the position of company. It's going to need a few stitches, she said gently. Want to know what that feels like before I start? He looked at her bruise, faded now to a pale yellow-green ghost of what it had been. What happened to your face? Parking structure, she said. A few weeks back. Did it hurt? Yes, she said. But I went to work anyway. He nodded like that settled something important. Okay, he said. Go ahead. Her hands were steady. They always had been, not because she was fearless, not because she was built from different material than anyone else in that building, but because she'd found the one thing she was meant to do, and she'd stayed with it through everything that tried to tear her away from it. The fog outside was finally lifting. The Oregon sky sliding from gray toward that brief pale gold before dark settled in for good. She had 20 more patients to see. She had a new job starting in 6 weeks that would take her into every hospital where quiet damage still hid behind polite silence. She didn't need anyone to know her old name, or the difference between who she used to be and who she was now, because the only thing that had ever mattered was showing up, paying attention, and saying exactly what she saw. So she went back to work.